Welcome back to Face the Nation. We turn now to foreign policy and a crucial question of military readiness. We are joined by the former National Security Advisor under President Obama, Tom Donilon, and the former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, retired Admiral James Sandy Winnefeld, who, I'm happy to say, is now also a CBS News Military and Homeland Security Advisor. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Sandy, I want to begin with you. I want to read to you something that was from a memorandum issued by the United States Navy after the USS McCain episode, a fatal episode, the second in the last 6 weeks. It said as part, the two deadly collisions I just referred to, quote, are not limited occurrences, but part of a disturbing trend of mishaps involving U.S. warships. I also want to read to you something from a Government Accounting Office report of 2015. The high pace of operations that the Navy uses for overseas home-ported ships limits dedicated training and maintenance periods, which has resulted in difficulty keeping crews fully trained and ships maintained. Admiral, can you tell our audience what's going on here? Is this a systemic problem? And do the families of U.S. sailors have to believe that their loved ones are in peril simply by doing their jobs?
Well, first of all, Major, our hearts reach out to the families of those sailors. They were doing something they loved, they were doing something extremely important, and their loss saddens us all. In the Pacific, it's a very unique situation. These are some of the most high-leveraged naval forces that we have in the country. To create the equivalent presence that these ships provide by being based out there, you'd have to have 3 or 4 ships back in the United States. They also get the very best stuff, our newest and latest and greatest equipment. But they're also our hardest working ships in the Navy. They have a very high operational tempo. Their maintenance is very stretched. Some of their basic training that they would need to operate out there is very stretched sometimes because they're out there on the leading edge of the spear.
Are they overtaxed?
Well, the Navy is obviously, based on the memo that you read, they're going to look very deeply into that question. It's a very valid question. It's one of the most dangerous operating environments in the world, where the USS McCain had her collision. Is one of the most. I've operated there. I've taken a ship through there at night. It's like operating on a superhighway, except there aren't any overpasses and nobody's obeying the stop signs. But at least it's pitch black. But that's no excuse. It's why we have to have the best trained people we possibly can out there, and the Navy's going to look very closely at that question.
And just at a simple, basic level, Admiral, how can 2 of the most prized vessels in the United States Navy, both of them with hugely important strategic missions, be offline for a year and a half? We lose 17 sailors. Wasn't anyone paying attention? I mean, these seem so basic.
Sure. A collision, without having the benefit of all the details of the investigation, we have to let that run its course, can be a result of human error or a material failure or some combination of the two. There are some indications, I think, that perhaps one of the collisions was human error and the other might have had a material component to it. But it does wrap into your larger question, and that is, is the funding out there right? Do they have the right amount of downtime for maintenance, for training? And the Navy's going to dig into that question because it's very important for not only these families, but for the families of every sailor in the Navy that we get this right.
In the USS McCain episode, hacking, did that play any role? Do you have any knowledge or a belief about that?
They will look very closely at all aspects of that. They include it in an accident investigation these days because hacking is so prominent. I would be very reluctant to suggest that that would be the case in this matter, but it certainly has to get looked at.
Tom Donilon, talking to you now about Afghanistan, the President's speech on Monday, your initial reaction to it, and do you believe it is wise for the President to focus, as he said, not on nation building, but on counterterrorism operations? And it sounds like special operators in the CIA are going to have a big footprint in this expansion of forces, whatever number that ultimately turns out to be.
Major, I want to say one thing. Following on Admiral Winnefeld's points too, the Navy is a high accountability organization, and we certainly owe it to our men and women in the Navy to get to the bottom of this and make sure their resources and training that they need and deserve. And Asia is really key, obviously strategically for the United States, and the Navy is a big part of our presence and our strategy in Asia. On Afghanistan, the President's speech laid out the same goals that have been laid out really by the last 2 presidents, President Bush 43 and President Obama. I think the strategies are basically the same going forward here. There's some increase in the number of troops. We don't know the exact number yet, but some increase in the number of troops, and there'll be some change in the rules of engagement has been laid out by the President, and Secretary Tillerson said the next day.
More assets probably brought to the table as well.
Yeah, and but it's essentially the same strategy at this point. I mean, if you look at the elements that were discussed, aggressive counterterrorism efforts, That has been the strategy of the United States for years in South Asia and in Afghanistan. You know, we during the Obama administration had an effort there with 150,000 troops, including 100,000 American troops. A regional approach, correct, I think, in concept, but it's been the approach that the United States has taken. Diplomatic aspect of this is important as a military aspect, and going after the safe harbors and leaning on safe havens and leaning on Pakistan, all part of the strategy we've had today. What you really have here, I think, is a declaration of an open-ended strategy, an open-ended commitment to carry on a counterterrorism effort in South Asia. Some increase in troops, trying to stop the momentum of the Taliban, trying to go after the safe havens, as I said, but essentially having kind of an ongoing open-ended counterterrorism campaign here to protect the country.
And when the White House described this, they said, well, it's new because there's no timetable for withdrawal. That's important. They thought that was an important distinction vis-a-vis the Obama administration. And it also said, we're not going to describe conditions, but we'll know what progress looks like.
It's an open-ended commitment with respect to the conditions-based versus the time-based point that the president made. We've been in Afghanistan 16 years. This has not been an effort that has lacked persistence or commitment, and the president's recommitted to it. And indeed, before President Obama left office in 2015, he indicated and decided that, in fact, the United States would not withdraw all its troops, given the conditions on the ground in Afghanistan. So we have here, I think, a really fundamental continuation of the strategy on an open-ended basis. One thing they didn't mention, by the way, Major, which I wanted to mention, is that I'm very concerned in Afghanistan about the role the Russians are playing. General Nicholson, as Winterfeld knows, has said a couple of times now that he worries about the Russians supplying arms to the Taliban. That's directly
all
contrary.
the White House will say is it's not being helpful.
Well, it's not. It's a lot.
You're saying it's much worse than that.
It's a lot more serious than not being helpful. You know, it's in violation of Security Council resolutions, right? You know, and it is it's arming the enemy of our soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan. It's a very serious matter. I think we should be much more aggressive about confronting.
Admiral Winterfeld, when you become a CBS consultant, you have to deal with hard breaks and short compressions of time. So in 30 seconds, is Afghanistan winnable? And is this a strategy that can help achieve that?
I think it's really important to understand that the president said we're going to win in Afghanistan. And asking that question, what does winning mean? That can be seen at two levels. Winning, if you look at the overall objective for our presence there, is prevention of attacks on the United States originating from that region, which we've successfully done for the last 16 years. And that's the open-ended nature that Tom is talking about. We don't know when this is going to end. It's hard to put a hard stop on it. But the principal objective of preventing attacks on the United States emanating from that region is there. Now, does that mean transforming Afghanistan fundamentally as a nation? That is a tough problem. That means winning a counterinsurgency. It means fixing a corrupt government. It means getting the region more stabilized, and that's going to be a much harder project.
Former Vice Admiral Sandy Winterfeld, thank you very much for your time. Tom Donlan, always great to see you. Thanks very much for your expertise. We'll be right back with our political panel. And we are back with our political panel. Allow me to introduce them to you now. Susan Page, Washington Bureau Chief for USA Today. Ben Domenech is the publisher of The Federalist. We're also joined by the national editor for the Cook Political Report, Amy Walter, and Clarence Page, columnist and senior member of the editorial board at the Chicago Tribune. Thank you very much for joining us. Susan, let me start with you. We could do an entire panel on just the 3 hours Friday night of last week from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m., but we'll broaden it a little bit from there. But let's start with that Friday night. Transgender military policy communicated to the Pentagon and a pardon for Maricopa County Sheriff Joe Arpaio. I won't ask you about the legalisms. Just what do you think is the political long-term effect of both of those decisions from the president? Will they last and linger?
You know, I think it is quite remarkable and of more importance in our usual discussion about the latest provocative tweet that the president has posted, because it goes to actual policy. It goes to policy at the Pentagon. It goes to policy on pardon powers that we may see over and over again in this presidency. That's entirely possible. And I think that's one reason we saw a bigger reaction from some key Republicans, including the House Speaker, Paul Ryan, than we have in the past. I do think this is different.
Ben, how do you assess the pardon of Sheriff Joe?
I think this was sending a message to the president's base. I mean, it's basically saying, I'm going to take this figure who for you is a significant figure, even if they don't have the necessary sort of national profile, and I'm going to make it clear that I'm with you in regards to this figure. But what surprised me a little bit was the timing of this. I felt like the president might have kept this in his back pocket for a little bit longer and used it at some point in order to make up for some failure of a legislative argument within the context of the border wall or another issue that might have come forward in the coming months. The fact that he used it now, I think, is just a sign that, you know, to his base that I'm with you, I'm going to defend the people that you like, and damn the media and all the missiles that they throw at me.
Clarence, the president said in Reno that we need to come together and unify around common values. What do you think the Joe Arpaio pardon, when you combine it with the speech he gave before Reno in Phoenix, where he talked again about, he didn't mean to reopen the wounds, but many of those remarks were interpreted as reopening the wounds of Charlottesville. How do you think the pardon of Joe Arpaio, someone who was with then-citizen Trump and the birther movement,
right,
and then was defying a federal court order about racial profiling, how does that play, how does that influence the credibility of what the president was talking about in Reno?
Well, this is what we're calling starting to call a Tuesday-Thursday move. The president was reasonable this week on Monday and Wednesday, a model of reasonableness and leadership and unity, and then was a model of disunity as far as Tuesday and Thursday were concerned. He said the same thing the night of his election. It's time to bring the country together and all. He has occasionally done that, but as we've also seen, he has basically been a base-oriented president who cares about his political base. And you're absolutely right that he sends a signal to his base with the Arpaio move. But back in Chicago, we'd say this is a good example of gangsta politics. He's sending a signal to anybody who might want to snitch on him or testify against him that, hey, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to watch out for my people. I am loyal to my people. And I'll pardon Joe Arpaio. I will pardon other people if I want to do it. And the Republicans give good lip service to opposing him, but they care about their agenda too. They need him too much right now, and so he's getting away with it at this point. And the question is, how long will he get away with it?
Are you suggesting that among the most interested parties Friday night was Mike Flynn?
I think he would be one of them, and there are others out there. But we just don't know. That's why you have investigations, to find out what's really going on. President Trump right now has gotten in the way of that investigation in a way that really echoes what James Comey says he was told, you know, that, hey, I care about loyalty, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not looking good for the president in the long run right now.
Amy, let's talk about the legislative agenda, such as it is. There's some important basic governing tasks that need to be accomplished in the month of September: raising the debt ceiling, funding the government to avoid a shutdown. And right before that, you not only have Arpaio and all these other things, you have a persistent effort with the president criticizing publicly. I think the last count is 1/5 of the Senate Republican Conference via Twitter.
That's not a traditional way to build.
That is not necessarily what most politicians would regard as a team-building exercise.
No, but I think what we saw this weekend, what we continue to see from this presidency, this is an isolated president. This is a guy who ran as I alone can fix this. But it is a lot easier to campaign as I alone. And it was a message, I think, that resonated with a lot of folks who were frustrated about the dysfunction in Washington, frustrated about institutions that they felt had let them down.
Looked at the Trump bio and thought maybe it's possible.
That's right. He's a business guy who's been able to create things. He can come in with a fresh perspective and shake up Washington. Well, he's been able to do that. But the I alone presidency is much more difficult than the I alone candidacy. And so the question, I think, for a whole bunch of voters, we don't know the answer to this yet, but as we go through, there are going to be these check marks or sort of semester grades. The first semester grade is the midterm elections. Our voters, do they believe that this system has worked for them? Do they believe that this way of doing business, yes, it's different, yes, it's norm busting, yes, it's chaotic, but it's actually resulting in something that they like to see? We don't quite have the answer to that, but it's clear that we're going to see this over and over again. One more thing about the isolating piece too. What's interesting about Arpaio is that, again, this is isolating the president in some ways too. He's getting hit on the left on immigration and the racial profiling that Arpaio was noted for, and so that is where the left is hitting him. On the right, it's the idea of the president thumbing his nose at the Constitution, right? This was a sheriff who disregarded a judge's orders and is getting pardoned for doing so. So he finds himself where he's always been, which is a man unto himself.
But let's be clear about what's really going on when it comes to the legislative agenda, and in agreement with Amy on all of her points. You saw this past week the placing of stories, a number of different stories from Mitch McConnell and his fellow travelers that clearly teed up a narrative about what's going to happen in September, which is a narrative of we can't do X because the president is crazy or uncontrollable or something like that. Mitch McConnell has led in the Senate for years, always having some villain to point to. It was the Tea Partiers, it was Ted Cruz. We have to do this thing that I don't really want to do because this aspect is forcing us to do it. He's putting Trump in that position right now. And it's teeing up a situation where he's going to go to the body in the Senate and basically say, well, I don't really want to do this deal, or I don't like this aspect of it. I share your negative opinion of it, but we have to do it because the president is the president.
And to that point, Susan, isn't there a co-vilification going on? The president telling the country via Twitter, Mitch McConnell is weak and he doesn't understand the rules of the Senate, because if he did, he would go to 51 votes on all legislation, not just high-profile judicial nominees, exempting the Supreme Court. He's creating a fallback position of blame as well, is he not?
So the vilification is by the Republican leader of the Senate and the Republican president, and to some degree the Republican Speaker of the House. And you know what that tells you is when you look at the legislative agenda, nobody runs for president saying, I'll raise the debt ceiling, or I'll fund the government so it doesn't have to shut down, right? That's a level of expectation. That's kind of a given. Not maybe a given this time. I assume that Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan are going to work together to make sure those two things happen. But what about the larger agenda that President Trump laid out? I think I think the prospects for tax reform go down every single minute, just ticking down. The idea that they'll get back to health care in a way that is consistent with what President Trump campaigned on as a candidate, I think is not maybe zero yet, but it's getting to that point.
Well, Clarence, they don't even talk about it at the White House anymore with any regularity, reviving the replace and repeal of the Affordable Care Act. It's just sort of, I mean, they may occasionally remember, throw that talking point in there, but it's not a part of the structural conversation at all. And tax reform, we had the Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, in the briefing room Friday saying, I told you a long time ago it'd be done by August. Clearly, I was wrong. And he was very, very careful. He also
said we're going to lift the debt ceiling, too.
Said, no problem, that's going to be done. So maybe he knows something we don't know. But at least on tax reform, he's now much more cautious and much more hesitant about making any kind of predictions.
Yes, he should be. You know, I mean, look at the tax debates we always have. You know, don't tax you, don't tax me, tax that guy behind that tree. You know, that's still true. And it's a very complicated debate, probably more complicated than health care at this point. And at the same time, President Trump is engaging in these orders that will appeal to his base, and he doesn't need Congress for either executive orders or, you know, the pardoning of Arpaio. And I was talking with a couple of Trump supporters who were just delighted with him, saying, well, look at all that he's accomplishing in office. While me and my colleagues talk about, look at all he's not accomplishing as far as major legislation goes. So that's why his numbers are still doing well.
Ben, do you think there is an important disconnect that we are in Washington tend to either miss entirely or overlook at our peril?
Well, I think that in the context of this broader debate, the real issue here is culture. I think that
That's the backdrop.
Trump has sort of delivered to his supporters an argument about about American culture that they find very appealing. I think you saw that this week in the fact that you had this embrace of this conversation about statues and monuments, as opposed to a conversation about racial radicals or things like that. The fact that so much of the conversation shifted to cities and towns that wanted to take down various Confederate monuments, or even, you know, the conversation that Bill de Blasio is having in New York right now about getting rid of the statue of Christopher Columbus. That's a win for President Trump. That's a win for his people. The fact that this conversation is even happening because they view him as a defender of their perspective on American culture and history.
That goes
to that point, Amy, the president said in Phoenix, the media is trying to take away our history and our culture.
Right.
Direct accusation.
This again, everything that people around this table said wasn't going to work for Donald Trump as candidate. He defied all of the normal political, the political norms, the political advice, and he won. So why should he listen to what anybody here in Washington has to tell him? I absolutely get that. The challenge right now, though, is he's not on the ballot in 2018. It's his party that's on the ballot in 2018. And when the president says Congress is worthless, they're not getting it done, they're not pushing the agenda, what it says to Republican voters is, why should I bother showing up to vote, right? Because the president, who I do like and has his own brand and does his own thing, we can talk about whether he's been successful in shaking up Washington, culturally defending me. He's doing all the right things. Congress isn't. So I'm not going to turn out and vote.
Are we
and
seeing
that's a
any
problem.
of that in Alabama in the special election for the United States Senate to replace Jeff Sessions?
Right. This is this really awkward place that Luther Strange, who's the sitting incumbent, finds himself. He's both supported by Mitch McConnell and President Trump. Now, there's been some reporting that Trump, now seeing that the race is maybe not a slam dunk for the guy that he endorsed, might not be as active in promoting him as we move on. The president doesn't like to lose, so he could distance himself a little bit. But this battle between the establishment and anti-establishment, this was going on long before Donald Trump, right? This Tea Party debate has been raging for a long time now. The question is, what happens? Does his party then become a separate brand from Donald Trump? And that, we don't know how that works.
Amy Walter, we'll have a lot more with our panel in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our outstanding political panel. Susan Page, Ben Domenech, Clarence Page, Amy Walter. Susan, the president gave a speech on Afghanistan Monday in which he did something he hardly ever does. Said, I went against my instincts. What I told you for years as a private citizen and on the campaign trail was wrong. We need to stay in Afghanistan, and here is why. Is that in itself an important moment of evolution for a commander-in-chief?
Yeah, it may be, because he listened to advisors around him, and he did something, and he did not rebuke President Obama to get out of Afghanistan, as he had promised to do during the campaign. He rebuked President Obama in doubling down on a commitment to Afghanistan that removed the timetable for withdrawal, that moved the idea that there's some moment we're going to be out of Afghanistan. And in fact, I think there's now every possibility that we'll have thousands of U.S. troops there throughout the Trump administration. When he leaves office, this longest war will go into a fourth president's agenda.
30 seconds, Ben.
This is just, I think, a sign to a lot of supporters of President Trump that, you know, in Washington, the swamp drains you. And the reality here is that his policy when it comes to Afghanistan is really very, very little different than what we would have seen under Hillary Clinton.
That might be the quotable quote of this panel. In Washington, the swamp drains you, you don't drain the swamp. I want to thank our panel and let you know we will be right back. That's it for us today. We will have continuing coverage of Hurricane Harvey on CBS News. Stay with us now for a special report. The mayor of Houston has just held a news conference. Then tonight, DeMarco Morgan will anchor the weekend news tonight from Houston. And CBS This Morning co-host Nora O'Donnell will anchor from Houston tomorrow morning. Thank you for watching Face the Nation. I'm Major Garrett.